Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have Ryan on this call.
Thank you.
Ryan is a rare gem in Canada, who is an expert in digital fundraising and engagement, because what I think a lot of organizations lack or don't understand is how to use digital in their matrix or programs in a way that helps with fundraising, instead of just saying like, we need to be more active on Twitter. And so you tweet a lot of stuff and it's lovely, but it doesn't do anything. And we're just like kindred spirits, which is the best. So Ryan, I want you to introduce yourself, and then I want us to talk a little bit about, because I've framed this around advocacy, and advocacy both in Canada and the States is kind of like a tricky subject, because we're kind of not allowed to do it. So introduce yourself, and then let's talk about, or like not allowed to, but there's parameters, right?
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they're really different in the US than they are in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But I will be brief. Cindy, thank you for having me. I am just as stoked. That is a very serious professional word that I use all the time, but just as stoked to be here. My name is Ryan Miller. I live in Toronto, Canada. I have been in this industry for 12 to 13 years. After I dropped out of a PhD in modern Buddhism. We could talk about that another time. And I came to this industry, my lens has been exclusively focused on the digital side of fundraising and campaigning and engagement and advocacy, as you said, Cindy. So I have a deep respect for all types of fundraising and all channels of fundraising. And I know very much so that although digital is a very kind of cool thing to talk about, actually the best way, a lot of the times, the best way that digital works is in conjunction with its kind of offline partners, like direct mail and telemarketing and other things. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that digital is like the only way to fundraise. In fact, it's still absolutely the minority of where revenue comes from. All that said, we all know that we're living in an increasingly digital world. And so we have to kind of be as smart as we can, especially with limited resources, about kind of when and where and how to use digital. And then also, I feel like I kind of, I work at the intersection of a couple things. So one of them is the intersection of fundraising and advocacy. Another one is the intersection of online and offline. And a third one is, although I'm Canadian, I have worked for 10 of my almost 13 years in the fundraising and nonprofit sector. I've worked for American companies. And I work at a company called Care2 now, and have for almost 8 years. It'll be 8 years in August. That's an American company. So I have had for a decade the privilege, and I mean that really sincerely, the privilege of working with super smart, super dedicated Americans. And I get to see, although I have always had a couple American clients, I tend to focus on the Canadian clients, but I've always gotten to kind of like hang out with and ask for case studies about, and ask my American colleagues for, kind of how campaigns and certain clients do things in the US. And I like to think about big ideas, hence my PhD. Or partial PhD, and therefore I like to think about kind of the differences between the US and Canada. So I think a whole bunch about the differences in how we do advocacy in Canada and view it compared to the US. In the US, generally, they're more kind of amenable to it. And they have a whole designation, right? A 501c4 as opposed to a C3. In Canada, there's, for a number of reasons, some of them kind of political, some related to the conservative government we had for almost 10 years, and some less so. We've taken a different approach, and charities have been, on the whole, less understanding. There's been a kind of a less friendly approach to the value or role of advocacy in general. Anyway, that's a long intro.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's start by talking about what advocacy can look like. And because I'd say the majority of our audience is in Canada and the rules are a little stricter, let's start there. But because I think people don't always feel comfortable wading into that territory because it just feels like, oh my God, am I going to
Yeah.
be funded or something like that?
Yeah, no, and that's actually the big thing that people jump to. So I know that very, very well. In my role at Care2, I have the opportunity of having a lot of kind of introductory phone calls and sort of coffee meetings and office meetings with people where we're essentially kind of getting to know each other. And I ask the question, does your organization do advocacy? And usually, most often, the answer is, oh gosh, no, I don't want to lose my charitable registration. And that to me is, I mean this really sincerely, but it's sad because that's not the way that things work. So number one, in Canada, you can do advocacy. Number two, you can do kind of 10% of what you do can be advocacy, and the CRA has a whole bunch of stuff online about that. But if you did less than 10% last year, you can do more this year. It's not quite, and usually 10% is actually really hard to reach. Some of my clients who are well-known organizations who do advocacy, it's like right kind of front and center, don't reach that 10%. But 10% of what you raise can go towards advocacy. So most organizations don't come close to reaching that 10% goal. That's number one. But number two, there's lots of different types of advocacy, and not all of it is political. Not all of it is negative. Not all of it is even what I call capital A advocacy. That it can be kind of softer advocacy. And so it can be the kind of advocacy that people like elected officials don't mind, or actually they do like. What this requires is actually kind of a difference in approach. Yeah. So there's kind of a lot to work on with Canadian organizations, because so many of them start with this response of, oh gosh, no, I don't want to lose my charitable registration or status. When in fact, advocacy can be a really kind of helpful tool in the toolkit that benefits fundraising and programs and everything else.
So can you talk a little bit more about that and how you can use advocacy as a launching point?
Sure.
or an engagement point?
Yeah. And can I start by saying, and I'm reading this because I forget things a lot, but a helpful definition for advocacy is, the way I see it, is that it's an umbrella term for activities and actions that people do to try and affect change. And I think it helps. That kind of reframing that I was just talking about, it helps when we think about it that way, because then you're like, oh, okay, it's not all political. It's not all tell the president or prime minister he needs to do X. It's not all like that. So it can include influencing decisions, be they political or economic or social or institutional. And the main thing that I always have kind of in my heart and in my head is that you're trying to make a difference. And when you think about it that way, trying to make a difference, or trying to make a positive difference, then it's really not that far away from donating, right? Yeah,
that's our core work, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I very much think of as being an activist or advocating for something as the other side of the coin, or kind of 2 points in the same stream.
Yeah.
I've got lots of metaphors and analogies.
So I often think of fundraising as matchmaking. And for major gifts, it's great because I have all these tools and conversations that let me uncover what people care about. Mm-hmm. But I think, and it's in your name, like one of the tools we have to figure out what people care about is and at the mass level, right? Not those one-on-one high-level donations, but at a broader reach, advocacy is a tool to uncover those passions. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit more about how it is a tool in engaging people in the core issues that your organization?
Yeah, well, I think I just made that comment about how I see it as different points in the same stream. And there is that great story that many fundraisers know about... I'm trying to remember what it is, but basically there's like, this feels almost all too real considering what's going on at US borders right now. It's terrifying, but the parable of babies in a river, right? Where you're basically, somebody starts off, whatever it is, downstream and sees there's a baby floating down the river. So they run into the river and they save the baby. And then as soon as they kind of get the baby to safety, they go back, and then there's 2 babies in the river, and then they have to save 2 babies. And this keeps multiplying. And at some point, more people come to help. And at some point, somebody says, well, we need to basically I'm going to walk further up the river to see what the heck is happening here and why these babies are here. And I think the purpose of this parable is for us to think about the symptoms and the cause, or the downstream and upstream. And I don't want to say versus upstream, although I could easily, but the two, generally speaking, in all of my experience in this sector, really, really help each other. And things don't tend to perform as well when you only have one or the other, right? When you only do advocacy and don't understand fundraising and the nature of those relationships, or only do fundraising and don't do any advocacy when you could. And so I think that giving money, and I mean this, I really do mean this respectfully, but it often does address the symptoms of the social problem. And giving time or energy or attention tends to at least try to address the cause of the social problem, and that those aren't set in stone rules. But I think that that's the thing that makes advocacy and fundraising actually work well together, is that, and why they work for a single individual, is that one person wants to do both of those things. And I have this line that I have mentioned to people, which is, what is the line? It's basically something along the lines of when you think about people, because I think donors are often activists, and activists make great donors. And that's a whole other issue that we could talk about, that historically we've treated those two lists as separate things, but they're actually kind of the same list of the same people. And I think that we should try and basically treat these people, activists who are donors and donors who are activists, as if you're in a relationship with them and you want them to think that you're both funny and smart, right? Like multiple value points. Does not need to be one or the other.
Yeah. I love that. Funny and smart.
Yeah.
Excellent. And I totally agree. Like most donors that I've worked with, whatever the amount they give because they want change, right? People want to affect change. We all do what we do because we want to affect change.
Yeah.
And I think giving people multiple outlets to deepen their commitment to the organization and your work is only beneficial. And I'll give you one example. It's not necessarily around advocacy, but I know a lot of people really struggle with, like, am I asking for too much? Am I asking too much of people? Am I asking them to do too many things? And the more you can align what you're doing with what you know they care about, it becomes an act of love. And there's no boundary to that. So I have volunteers I work with at organizations, and I feel like I'm asking something of them every week. And I'm asking for another gift and a gift for something else. And they keep saying yes. I ask them to host something. Of course. Come out to this. Of course. Because they genuinely love it. And they get so much value out of that engagement and give. So I think that understanding people's motivations, it goes very far in your ability to engage them.
Yep.
So I want to talk a little bit, like, in the weeds around like how to actually engage your existing audience, or even find an audience through advocacy. And I know the tools that you guys have at Care2 can facilitate that, but it doesn't, even more broadly. Yeah,
absolutely. So the starting point is that although advocacy has happened for long before the internet age, the digital era makes advocacy much easier, and makes, like, the broader, kind of bigger umbrella term would be engagement, makes engagement much easier. So sometimes like the example of advocacy that most people have is often a petition or an online petition. And that is indeed a great example. But sometimes, and the reason why engagement sometimes is a more helpful term, is that sometimes you're doing something that actually is not related to a petition, but you might want to do something like have your constituents write letters to the editor, of a certain paper, right? Or let people know or encourage people to call an elected official or MPP or MP or whoever it is to say, just so you know, I really care about this issue, or we all care about this issue. So sometimes it's more engagement than real kind of advocacy. But to your question, so digital, number one, digital makes things a lot easier. Number two, I think the basic starting points are organic versus paid. And so you've got a couple kind of options with organic. So you have your own existing list and file, and that's a good place to start. So certainly if you are an organization that really kind of like, has a good system humming along for fundraising and wondering if and how to start using advocacy, one of your starting points should be to see not just internally what the programs you're working on to see kind of what fit, but also who on your list might make good activists, basically. Like I was saying before, I think a lot of people who are donors are already activists. They just kind of haven't been activated. But we don't know that yet, and you certainly don't want to kind of make any sort of assumptions. So there's there's that organic stuff, and then the rest of organic, besides just your existing file, like you can launch your own campaign and kind of send it out into the world and use all the digital and social platform channels that you have, right? Like put it on Facebook, put it on Twitter and the other places. Try and get media attention, like earned media attention, assuming that the campaign, that whatever it is you're talking about, or the campaign is kind of topical or like, in the news. And then there's a number of paid channels, and sometimes those are in the same category as organic, like the social channels, right? Like you can do Facebook for free, and you are assured to have limited reach, or you can do paid Facebook where you are assured to have greater reach, and that is what you were paying for. You can also do things like work with companies, and Care2 is one of them, but not the only one, who will run a campaign with you. And at the end of it, you will get kind of a fixed number of people who have signed up for your campaign and signed up to your list. And so there's a number of options. Essentially, those aren't just advocacy where you get kind of petition signers. I think they are that, but in addition to that, I think what you want to be doing the whole time is basically collecting data on these people. And I don't mean that in a Cambridge Analytica way. I mean, you want to start a relationship with these people, and to do that, you need to communicate with them in a very kind of good old-fashioned relationship way.
Yeah.
It's never a good idea to say, sign my petition, see you later, I may or may not ever talk to you again.
Yeah.
It is, on the other hand, a very good idea to say, this is what we're talking about. We are the subject matter experts. Do you want to join us, sign this petition, or do this other thing that we're asking you to do, and also join our list? And we're going to ask you, we're going to have a couple fields, right? We're going to ask you first name, last name, mailing address, phone number, and we will be in touch with you. And so the idea is to not have an advocacy campaign kind of out there in the ether, existing on its own, but to think about it right at the beginning stages of campaign planning, so that it can be properly embedded into the other goals of your organization, including fundraising.
One of the things I find most fascinating about this approach, and I want to see kind of like I want to hear from everyone on the phone, like one of the things small organizations struggle with is donor acquisition, right? Finding a prospect list of potential donors who might be inclined to care about your work. And like back in the day, 15 years ago, we used to trade lists with other organizations. I know organizations still do that, but I feel like it's a little antiquated and not really what people want you to do with their information. And so we always get the question, where do I find new donors? Where do I find new donors? So I want to hear from everyone, just yes or no in the chat. Do you have a strategy for identifying potential donors based on how much they care about your cause?
That's such a great question.
Yeah, or you can elaborate and tell us where you find your new donors, because it's getting harder and harder. And I think this is anytime I think of a potential new donor, it's not about their capacity, it's about how much they care.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so to me, this is like, hello, you can put things out and find the people who are inclined to care. And yeah, it might cost you a little bit through Facebook ads or something like that, but A, you can target really effectively, and B, you're engaging people in the cause so that they're more inclined, and you can nurture them in a really meaningful way.
Absolutely.
I think it's like brilliant, and
Yeah.
I don't know why more organizations aren't doing it.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's not like this is a secret in any way, but my larger clients, who are all issue-based organizations who have very well-known brand names that you know, spanning from kind of like environmental groups to human rights to animal rights and welfare, et cetera. But they all use advocacy as a donor acquisition tool. And I do not mean that in a way that's disrespectful to the idea of advocacy, because they are doing it in conjunction with the program staff or campaigners on staff. This is not like fundraisers trying to manipulate an idea for their own ends. It's basically we need new people. The best way, it's basically saying what you just said, Cindy. We need new people. How do we get new people? Oh, we talk about the thing that we're a subject matter expert on. We share that, and we find a way for people to join us, right? Because it's one thing to be a subject matter expert, but it's kind of almost useless if you're not using that as a way to kind of engage people and bring people in.
Yeah. Okay, the biggest thing, I feel like we've kind of gotten to this like jargony area around acquisition, and even Facebook ads, I think, are very overwhelming to a lot of organizations. So I want to break down that barrier for people because I think that's practical. I really want people to walk away with this and think, okay, I can do something. And it doesn't have to be using a tool like Care2. You can use MailChimp and have a form where people submit under a call to action.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily super sophisticated in terms of setting it up.
Oh yeah, no, and most times shouldn't be, actually, because we're just talking. Really, you should be less focused on, as in all things, the technology is the vehicle, but not the destination, right? It should never be the focus. You should always be usually the simple solution is the best solution. So to your point, for sure. I mean, there are times when like a Google web form is going to be the best way for you to kind of like gather information or whatever it is.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's really not about kind of like the technology or the service itself. Do you want me to speak to specific things, or is that enough of a, okay.
Yeah, we like specifics.
Well, where to start? So I think that it's definitely true that things can feel overwhelming. And I think that especially if you are a smaller organization and inevitably constrained by resources, both human and financial, it is hard to imagine. Like you probably go on Facebook in your spare time and see examples. I mean, I know this is most of my, sorry, I'm playing with a hair elastic. It's like my stuffed animal. You probably go on Facebook, like whether it's at night or during the day, and see examples of other organizations who are rocking it, right? Like, look, this amazing campaign, and look what they're doing, and yeah.
Or you have a board member who says that too, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So-and-so organization is doing this. Like, how do we do that? Or why aren't we doing that?
Yeah. Or what is our Twitter strategy? Which is a question I would love to never hear again. I think that, I think a couple things. So tactically running a Facebook campaign or getting your campaign onto Facebook is not as hard as it seems. This sounds probably hopelessly obvious, but I highly recommend YouTube tutorial videos. They have, let me start by saying I am not a Facebook campaign expert. I just live in a world where people are running them all the time, but I am not actually the expert. But I know I have friends and Care2 people. We have we know and understand Facebook very well within Care2. And good question, Bruce McIntosh. Board members and EDs like to ask that question. And sometimes there is, but oftentimes, usually the answer is no, but sometimes there is. YouTube is a fantastic resource for under 5-minute tutorial and how-to videos on how to do various things on Facebook.
I just posted a link to my favorite Facebook ad guru is Rick Mulready.
Cool.
But there's tons of people. There's so many free resources, totally free. There's podcasts, and you could literally make this a second career, but you don't have to. There's simple things you can set up. There are simple things you can set up. I think within the world of Facebook, you have to think about essentially kind of what your goals are, right? So you can, if you have, there's a number of things that you can do, like promote a post that you have. You can also do a lookalike audience. So if you, for example, if you do run some sort of online acquisition campaign where you get in a bunch of new people, let's say they are activists and they're really committed to the cause that you are that you focus on, you might then want to upload that list into Facebook and run a lookalike campaign, which is basically saying to Facebook, here are the people that we like best, we like right now best. Or that like us best.
Like us best. Find more of these people. Which is, I think, actually one of the best kind of types of campaigns or ways to use Facebook. But not to get super hashtag deep on everyone, but I do want to say, I can't help myself. I do want to say that in the world of digital in general, we have this problem with confusing strategy for tactics and tactics for strategy. And it's kind of, it's making everything really confusing, and it really speaks to Bruce's question, is there such a thing as a Twitter strategy? And then ever, which is a wonderful question. Even if it's sarcastic, it's even more wonderful. And I think that I have a lot to say about this. I have a couple slide decks up on SlideShare about this issue of kind of digital is becoming a strategy. It used to be tactics. But the main point is, I think most organizations who don't have a huge dedicated digital team, right? And that's most of us.
That's being generous. Yeah.
I think most organizations see all things digital as a bunch of kind of random or disparate tactics, right? So digital is a random assortment of email and website and maybe Facebook, and maybe pull in or leave out one or two things depending on the campaign or the goals. And increasingly, I think we need to start thinking about it like it's a strategy, like we do with fundraising, right? So when we think of fundraising in a smart way, in a way, the way that we talk to an ED or a board about it, we talk about our big picture goals, and then we break it down more tactically into channels and different types of relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And we are at a place now where we need to start doing that with digital. So I think of Twitter as a tactic, not a strategy. Overwhelmingly, there are exceptions to this rule, but usually it's what are we trying to do? So for example, maybe the goal is increase our, we want to find two things: more new monthly donors, and also increase our email list size. And those are two pretty common things, because of all if you kind of increase your email list and then you try and convert all those people to monthly donors, those people will stay on the email list, and then you still also have the people who have not converted yet to become a donor or monthly donor. So you have those two goals that kind of work nicely together. That's a common kind of big picture goal for a lot of my clients and organizations in general. And so what you would do is say, okay, what are we going to say, right? What can we talk about? And then you find something to talk about. You obviously have to kind of figure out what audience you're targeting versus who your kind of innate constituency is. And then at the end of all of that, your timing, your audience, what tools you have in your kind of toolkit, then you can talk about the tools to use. Then you say, does Twitter make sense? Yes or no? And then you can be ready to say to that board member, no, we didn't use Twitter because it made 0 sense. And that would be a waste of our organization's resources. But what we did do was use something else. We did digital ads because we knew this one website, we're targeting whatever it is, the campaigns on birds, and golf courses, and this is like a golf website, whatever it might look like. And then you kind of figure out what essentially kind of like digital engagement tools can be your tactics that can speak up to your strategy.
Yeah.
That's kind of the best way to look at it.
Is there a difference between looking at it from an acquisition perspective versus a stewardship or engagement? Are those two strategies or one? And if they're two, what would be the difference?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is there are always differences. Sometimes they're more subtle and sometimes they're super clear and obvious and not subtle. But there are organizations who go into it thinking using advocacy for acquisition is just the strategy, and then we will talk to these people the exact same way all the way through, and we will fold in our existing donors, and we'll speak to them all the same way, and that never ends up working super well or making much sense. There are nuances, and it also depends on kind of where you kind of are. If you are just starting off, so let's assume that most organizations kind of do fundraising, right? And are newer to advocacy, which is not all organizations, but
it seemed like doing fundraising, but at a small scale, right?
Yeah.
Like small organization, because that's what we try. Yeah,
to focus on, absolutely. So if you are a small organization and you do fundraising and you're like, hey, I think we can use advocacy as an acquisition tool. Number one, yes, I agree. But specifically, I think you can use one overarching campaign, but I think you will have to do a little bit of testing with your existing audience to make sure that the way that you're speaking to them fits with them. And because it might be slightly different from the way you're speaking to a new audience, right? So I think for just like the way we do direct mail differently for existing donors versus prospect mail.
So you should be doing direct mail.
Should be.
But it doesn't always translate into the function of working in a small organization, which is, we should talk about that again later, because some of the, I think people hear the segmentation and they're like, so much work.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's as simple as changing like 2 lines. And, just making sure that we understand and acknowledge people's relationship with us.
That's exactly it.
And how that might be different. So
that's exactly it. And one of the things that's most obvious is if you are an organization that does, and at least generally understands the value of fundraising and does some fundraising, and you have some kind of list, but you've never done advocacy before, there might be some people on that list that don't respond well to it. And so here's the thing. I stand by that statement I made at the beginning that I do think that most donors are activists and activists are donors. They are the same people. They're two sides of the same coin. I absolutely stand by that. But some of the nuances to consider are how you've been talking with your list the entire time, like the entire time that they've been on your list. So if all you've done is send 4 emails a year and they've just been like, here's our annual report, it's year end, here's our annual report and give, it's year end and give, and 2 other, whatever it is, it's springtime, give. And then you start saying, we're going to talk to X, or we want to reach Mr. Bad Guy or elected representative who we're trying to kind of like change the heart and mind of. If you just throw an advocacy campaign at them, there's likely going to be a couple people on your list who are like, what is happening here? Who are you and what are you doing? What happened to this organization? I used to be able to count on no real relationship or communication with you. And so it requires, over time, you either have to do this work up front or you will see that you will have to do the work later on. But one way or the other, you will have to kind of see what your existing list what their sort of risk tolerance, not risk tolerance level is, but like advocacy tolerance level is. And you will have to slowly and subtly, if you do want to kind of combine the two together, so that for the sake of ease for small shops, so that the way you're talking with new people doing acquisition is the same way that you're talking with your existing file. And I totally understand that that is the ideal. But if you are using kind of more activist, more engaged language for the advocacy acquisition campaign people, there's a good chance that some people in the existing file aren't going to be used to that language. And so you have to sort of ease them into, this is who we are now. This is what we're starting to do now. But I can tell you that in the US, since Trump was elected, there are thousands of organizations who decided November 2016, no, we're going to focus on fundraising, and other people are working on the policy stuff, other people are working on the advocacy stuff in the same issue area, right? Homelessness or whatever it might be, or immigration related issues, LGBTQ2+ related issues, et cetera, et cetera. There used to be this kind of ease of separation before, and now there are thousands of organizations who are saying, you know what, before was before. Now we are dipping our toe or stepping into this advocacy fray. We now see that we can't do the fundraising without also talking about the policy change, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I think that it's not hard to do, but you do have to train your list. I think that's the key part. You have to train your list, and I mean that respectfully. We're talking about relationships with real human beings, but you need to, when I say train your list, really what I'm saying is you need to kind of slowly but surely kind of introduce them to this new language that you're using and these campaigns that you're running. And my best advice to do that is to be really transparent. Yeah. And if you lose a couple people, you will lose a couple people, and I do not mean to suggest that it's no big deal to lose a couple people. But in my experience, any campaign that's a good campaign that tends to perform really well, and I mean fundraising metrics here, there are always a couple angry donors who call or who write letters or who send emails. That is actually the mark of a good fundraising campaign, is did we get a couple angry people? And hopefully often you can try and, if you can engage with that person, you can actually try and get a good donation out of them once you hear why they're upset, etc. But you should expect some friction and tension, because you are changing to some slight extent the nature of the relationship.
Yeah. One of the things we do a lot with organizations we work with, especially as we start working with them, is a donor survey. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we almost always ask is why they support the organization. And we ask them for messages to go back to the staff or the clients or, whoever. And the purpose of that is to figure out what they're most passionate about around the organization. So I even think that you can use tools like that to understand how they think about your work, so that the advocacy conversation or language actually is built directly from their language.
Absolutely.
Because as much as it's aligned with your mission, and I wouldn't suggest doing things that are not, but you might have a mission, but there's language nuances, and certainly in our sector, we all get bogged down in jargon and all of that thing. But if you can understand what makes your donors tick and how that's aligned with what makes your organization tick, and leverage that as the foundation for this kind of advocacy and engagement, I think you're not gonna. I mean, it's true to your organization, it's true to your donors. If someone's there at the wrong game, or like giving to the wrong organization, I agree. Like, maybe they're not the right person to be giving, but hopefully all these other donors who are giving, and now you're engaging them on the issues that they care about, become more deeply engaged. You can find new donors through this type of work. And I talk a lot about how you engage your existing donors to find new donors themselves. And if you can do an organic digital campaign where you're engaging people and they're sharing and they're passionate, you're going to reach their network.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think that there's you know, at the end of the day, our conversation that you and I are having about kind of activists and donors and turning activists into donors, there's the why, and then there's also the how. But to your point about why, not only are they natural allies, not only does it let you show impact, and it strengthens the relationship to the point that you were just saying, but and obviously shows donors that they're valued not just for their wallets, but also they will amplify your cause or issue. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to ask a question about like this isn't the right word, but non-traditional advocacy. So for example, we all know that there's certain things you can really passionately rally people around that like we all think of as advocacy.
Yep.
But do you have any examples of organizations where they've created advocacy out of something that isn't as prominent or in the news or as urgent and critical as like, you know, some of today's world events, but that they've still been able to engage people in a meaningful way?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's actually hard for me to think of one or two examples, only because this is what Care2 does all the time. So what we do a great deal of is essentially using the principles of advocacy to help organizations find new lists of engaged donor leads, basically. But we essentially can use online advocacy as the kind of vehicle, like I was referencing before, that some of the kind of largest organizations that we all know in Canada and the US use this as a real specific, like written out in the strategic plan strategy. And so I absolutely, I mean, the short answer is yes. I've got tons of examples of organizations that so what I call it, I don't know if other people call it this either, but what I call it is the term that I use for this, make this distinction clear, is capital A advocacy and small a advocacy. And the main idea is that there's a whole universe of small a advocacy out there. And what that is basically taking the principles of advocacy, or as many as you can, right? Because let's say there's like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 main principles. They're not all going to work for you. And if they did, you could do capital A advocacy. So for example, let's say you don't have urgency, but can you, do you have a target? And when I say target, I mean a real human person or company that you can actually kind of focus your attention on as where you want to create change. And so a good starting place for this, and this is, I don't know if this is a term that the folks on this call might be familiar with or not, or if you are, Cindy, but a good starting place for this is to develop a theory of change. But I will not do it justice, but the main idea is kind of write out or think out your goal, and then think backwards of how you will get there and make the steps tangible. And one of the problems with digital advocacy in this day and age, is that I think a lot of organizations think if they essentially kind of slap up an online petition, that there's the campaign right there. And people are too sophisticated kind of psychologically for that. They kind of know, like, you don't just sign a petition. You just sign a petition, never hear an update or never hear about the issue again. That is an unsatisfactory exchange, right? We're not going to be super likely to donate to that organization when they follow up and ask for money. There's kind of going to be a demerit point or two in general, like a vague feeling of lack of trust, probably. So having a theory of change kind of ensures that you can actually, you can get to where you're talking about. So even if you fail, you can go back and turn that into, number one, a great kind of fundraising appeal, and number two, a great just kind of general engagement. So I'm rambling a little bit, but the main idea is have a theory of change in general, whether your advocacy campaign is kind of capital A or small a advocacy. And try and be kind of transparent about it as much as possible. But there's lots of campaigns out there, like, so I mentioned this at the top of our call, but that not all advocacy campaigns need to be negative, right? So you can have a positive campaign. You can thank an MP or a senator for taking action on something, or for standing up and speaking about an issue that your organization works on. That's also obviously a great way to curry favor for later. But you can also have a letter writing campaign that is a positive campaign that's kind of forward thinking, not thinking for something in the past tense, but forward thinking. So a letter writing campaign, both virtual or physical, or both virtual and physical, that says something along the lines of, this is the issue that we're working on, and I really care about this issue. I'm asking you to do X or Y, or to like consider the importance of X or Y. So there's no real kind of tangible outcome there, but it is an advocacy campaign. It may or may not have urgency, or may or may not have tangibility. So sometimes we're asking MPs or the Prime Minister or President or elected whoever it is, Congress people, to pass legislation or stop legislation. But there really is an entire universe of both positive campaigns that are kind of friendly, where that elected representative is going to pay attention but does not in any way feel threatened, or removing the political from this entirely. You can have a campaign that is structured around essentially kind of an emotional or psychological value point or ideal.
Yeah. All right, I'm aware we have about 10 minutes left, and definitely people jump in if you have any questions or if you need clarification or anything like that. One of the things I was told, again, everyone's always talking about acquisition. So we all know the street canvassers, right? Going around asking people to, do you care about sick kids or what have you? My understanding, and if anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, is that those, and they're almost always big charities using that, because the cost per acquisition is super high. It takes 2.5 years for that charity to make back that investment before they start seeing a return for every single donor they acquire. Do you have metrics around cost per acquisition generally for organizations when they use advocacy as a tool for that?
So it's definitely true that face-to-face, the costs are high. And the large orgs use it because it's so scalable, right? If you're a large org, it makes sense. But for all the rest of us,
yes,
who cannot and will not be doing that for a host of reasons, mostly money, I can tell you, there's kind of, I have these metrics that I know that live in my head that are mostly Care 2, but not limited to Care 2. And so with Care 2, there's a cost. There's a cost to acquire essentially a kind of like activist donor lead, right? You can call them an activist, you can call them a donor lead, they're kind of both. So there's a fixed cost to acquire that name. And then everything after that is on the organization itself, right? So are you gonna do it in-house, or are you gonna hire an agency to help you convert these people to donors and to do the digital engagement, like the relationship building stuff online? Or are you going to use direct mail to treat these people like digital prospects, right? To try and convert them to monthly and one-time donors through direct mail or telemarketing. So there are costs. Generally speaking, what I know to be true with the Care 2 campaign is you can more or less expect to break even between 9 to 18 months. It used to be longer. So I've been at Care 2 for 8 years. So I have like the kind of like dinosaurs historical perspective of like what the metrics look like 8 years ago versus now. And I'm pleased to say it was closer to kind of 2 years, especially for smaller organizations where you couldn't just kind of roll in, right? A smaller organization tends to use telemarketing, for example, less or not at all. And therefore you can't just kind of roll in a Care 2 list with your ongoing telemarketing campaigns. So sometimes the costs are really, unfortunately, higher for smaller organizations because they're kind of stop-start.
Yeah.
So the time to break even used to be closer to 2 years. Now it's way more like 9 to 18 months. Like the average is about 12.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you kind of like what the average monthly gift is, because that obviously depends on the sector and subsector. But I can tell you that that multi-channel, and it's partly why I keep referencing using direct mail and using telemarketing, multi-channel works really, really well, works the best. This is not necessarily the case in the US, where people just respond more to email, but in Canada, donors and prospective donors do not respond as much to email. So email is still great to use as your kind of main relationship channel. But when it comes time to trying to convert these online activist leads to donors, usually the best strategy is to take them offline, whether that's direct mail or telemarketing. And those results tend to be between, with direct mail, it tends to be between kind of like 1 to 4% monthly donor conversion plus 1 to 4% one-time gift conversion. And using telemarketing, it's about kind of like 4 to 11, sometimes even 12% monthly donor conversion plus 4 to 11 or 12% one-time gift conversion. So then the stats are there to kind of bear out this idea.
So for people who don't know, like if you're renting a list, say, like I think half to 1% response rate is considered really good, right? Like it's, so these are significantly higher. Because we know they're more targeted, right?
Yeah, exactly. We know they're more targeted. Like the nature of Care2, and also if you were to run a similar campaign on Facebook, it would look the same. But online advocacy in general is you're asking people to raise their psychological hand, right? And say, do you care about X? And then when you're getting them to sign, you're also asking them for their data. And so when they're only signing up after deciding that they care about your issue. So it is a fundamentally different kind of like start of a relationship than direct mail prospecting.
Yeah, totally. That's why I think it's so meaningful, because issue-based.
Yeah.
And so much of the work we do is around issues.
Yeah.
And I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning. It's all about matchmaking, right? So how are you finding the people who care about your organization? How are you engaging them in the things they care about?
Yeah.
And we've talked, I just think it's such a great tool for acquisition, but as we talked about before, there's so many different ways, and to blend it in with the other work that you're doing, I think that's huge potential for small organizations.
Me too.
Yeah, amazing. All right, I want to give, if anyone has any questions, and it can be, I'm going to pull a Gary Vee, and it can be like in the sky or in the weeds. For those of you who don't know Gary Vee, I apologize, but like high level strategy, like how am I thinking about this? Like how do I wrap my head around it? Or like really tactical, like, you know, how do we run a Facebook campaign, but like you mentioned targeted audiences or lookalikes. What does that mean? Totally, we can answer anything.
And also, while you folks are thinking about questions, I want to mention that Care2 has a bunch of resources on this stuff. Care2services.com is the place to go. Care2.com, you are going to kind of like the public facing side of the website. That's where there's 45 million members. That's wonderful. Not what we're talking about now. Care2services.com is essentially where we are talking to organizations about kind of what we do and how we do it. But we've been at this, Care2's been doing this for almost 20 years. Almost 20 years. Like we predate Facebook by a lot. We predate Google by like a week. So we know what we're doing. We test constantly, and we're still around, and really just growing exponentially these days. And so we've done countless webinars, and actually 2 days ago, last week, I did a webinar with a guy named Brad Shank, who's this essentially kind of like a digital expert guy, and it was an interesting webinar where he talked about essentially kind of like the goals and tactics and the importance of that, of kind of like project planning for a good digital campaign. So that might be worth checking out. All that stuff is somewhere on care2services.com. So yeah, if you're not sure kind of what questions to ask, that might be a good starting place.
Awesome. Amazing. I'm going to throw up here, guys, we just started a YouTube channel where we're going to be posting these master classes for your consumption. There are, not all of them are up there yet, but we will have one up on the logic model that you sort of the theory of change stuff. So that might be helpful for you. There's tons of other resources. Definitely check that out. And we do have a question. Amy asked, you mentioned that all advocacy campaigns do not have to be political. Can you talk more about non-political campaigns?
Yeah, and that is, most of my clients running Care2 campaigns are absolutely running non-political campaigns. So they are, so some of them are more kind of pledge style and not petitions at all. So it's along the lines of like a kind of UNICEF or plan, not specifically those, but that kind of like, do you believe that all girls in Ethiopia have the right to an education? That sort of thing. So that's more of a pledge and less advocacy, but it serves the same purpose, right? It's the same, like that is a vehicle that's trying to get you to the same goal. And that is, your issue area expertise and finding new people. So that's that kind of softer pledge. And then it's essentially like a continuum, right? So you have the kind of, do you believe, or sometimes for a health organization or hospital foundation, it'll be along the lines of, little Jimmy had a really rare form of cancer. Our scientists are working day and night to try and find a cure. Raise your hand to support the work of X, Ryan Miller, this scientist who's working on this. So you just essentially kind of raise your hand because you believe in this sort of thing. So that's not advocacy in any way, shape, or form, but it is saying this is the thing that we are an expert on. And this is like, and I know you care about us because you're choosing to raise your hand on this. And yeah, I could go on and on with examples like that. Yes.
I'm going to say, Amy, can you tell us what your organization does? And maybe there's actually an example, or we can sort of create some recommendations around what that could look like.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Because I like to be practical.
Yes.
Not that wasn't a practical response, but you might be able to walk away with something that you can actually
use.
Implement.
Absolutely.
So Amy, if you feel up to it, you can let us know. There we go. Okay. Water First. First Nation communities on water challenges through education and training.
Nice.
First of all, thank
Wonderful.
you. Yeah.
Amazing.
Great work. So, Ryan, are there examples, or can you, just based on what you know, suggest good places to start?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, the hardest part will be kind of limiting your creativity, because there's so many different directions to go. It's basically kind of a focus on First Nations, kind of like basic rights, or focus on environmental and like drinking water specifically. But talking about that continuum again, you could go with something as kind of pledgy as something like, do you believe that the right to clean water is a fundamental right? Something along those lines, which will get people to raise their hand for sure, but will not be, I'm sorry for this hard truth, but will not be as compelling as if you have something that's a little bit more tangible, right? So if you have something that actually has a theory of change, if you have something that where you are, I'm reading about your organization, work with First Nations communities on water challenges through education and training. So if you are trying to, let's say maybe you're working on some sort of like water plant, a water treating facility, and you know, I don't know, I mean, you know that you can you can, this is something that you can fundraise around, number one. That's something to think about. But also getting the government to pay for a water treatment plant. You could absolutely encourage, write a letter writing campaign, or letters to the editor, or calls to an elected official or representative saying something along the lines of, this community, or these communities plural, don't have access to clean water. This is why it's so important. The UN says X or Y. We have a solution. We have a plan. We want to do X in this place for this First Nations community, and we will combine it with education. We have all these things in place, but we need government official. We need you to okay this, or to put money behind it. Even if you take the kind of, that's not like, it's clearly not, it's not a real political campaign, even if you are speaking to a government representative. But even taking anything kind of government related out of it, if you just want to use this kind of work that you do to try and find new people, I definitely think that a good starting place would be talking about essentially kind of like the fundamental rights that everybody should have around clean and safe water, and kind of the environmental threats that are facing Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, and essentially kind of like using those angles to see what people care about this issue. And using that as like a amazing starting point for building a community of people who care about this issue, who will also later go on to give you money.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you, Amy.
Thank you for your work, because that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, now we're over time, so anyone can feel free to email me if you have any other questions. Also, because we're gearing up for the fall season, I guess, of masterclasses, and going to be launching a podcast. If you have a second, reply to any of my emails and let me know what you want to hear more about, and we will find expert guests or just talk about it ourselves and try help meet your needs where you are. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Cindy, thank you for having me on. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Ryan. It's totally my pleasure, and everyone else's, and we really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Bye.